Pardon the interruption. I'm Sam Mulberry, joined by
Chris Garrett.
Chris, we are right on the verge of the Unit 1 exam. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the exam. We're going to be talking about the second half of this unit. In the second half of this unit, we turned to the first few centuries of Christianity. I want you to answer me this question. Why is the early church the most important era we study in CWC?
Sure. Well, I think Sam did this last time for the ancient world, so I'll take a crack with the early church. It's for obvious reasons. This is where Christianity joins the mix, right? This is where we start encountering some of the recurring questions and the tensions, really, of the rest of the class. So, this is all still kind of introductions here. And so this is where we start thinking about how do Christians relate to Western culture. And we get a spectrum of everyone from the Gnostics, affirming Platonic philosophy, to Tertullian, asking what Athens has to do with Jerusalem, to the author of the letter to Diognetus, talking about kind of straddling this middle. And we'll hear more about this as we go. I think it's also important because in so many ways, we give authority to the earliest centuries, to the early church, or churches, we should call it. One of the questions we ask in the class is, how do we answer questions? And a version of that we'll probably ask is, what do we give authorities to? What do we trust? And so, first of all, this is where scripture comes from, right? It's in this time period of the church that what we recognize as the scriptures are being written, they're being distributed, and they're being analyzed and interpreted and debated, and they're causing disagreements. And then we have a canon, but that's being debated. So, every Christian in some way gives authority to scripture. This is where those texts come from, and so that's important. And then in other ways, I think every Christian tradition gives authority. So for Catholicism, what gives authority to the church is this idea of there's a line of succession going back to the apostles, right? And it stretches back to the very first disciples and then forward in time. For Protestants, when we get to the Reformation, in a lot of ways, what they're saying is we need to go back to the source of the early church. And they kind of differ what they mean by that. Anabaptists will mean before Constantine. Others probably mean something after Constantine or Augustine or something. But there's something powerful about those theologians and that story of the church for later Christians. So Sam, in segment 2, Professor Shady is going to join us, and she and I are going to rank the most significant people from Unit 1. Why should I rank Augustine or Augustine high on my list in what we call food chain?
Well, Chris, it's tricky because in some ways Augustine is arguably more important to Unit 2 than he is to Unit 1, even though we're going to talk about him in both, but we spend more time in Unit 1 talking about when we have a whole lecture about him. He's important because he shapes the Christian theology so deeply. In lecture, we made the case today that he's the most important figure in the church since the Apostle Paul. And if you go through the rest of this course, Augustine will get mentioned in almost every lecture we have going forward in one way, shape, or form. So he shapes theology through debates. He wrestles with this idea of Christianity and empire. So, we raised some of these questions when we talked about Constantine in lecture last Friday, but now we are living in a world after Constantine, and there is all these questions about how do Christians relate to the empire. Augustine, and we'll see this in Unit 2 when we talk about Augustine, he's going to give us one of the first really profound statements about thinking about this new relationship in something like City of God. And I would say one thing we've already seen in this unit from him is that he deeply interacts with the Greco-Roman world. So we talked about Tertullian and the Gnostics as these kind of polar examples of this Christianity-Western culture situation. But Augustine really carves a path where he's going to say, Greco-Roman culture can help us understand Christianity. Plato can help us understand the gospel. He says this in Confessions. So I just think he's unbelievably important, and we're going to understand his impact continuously as we go forward. Chris, the first exam is coming up on Monday. Can you give us a little reminder about how this exam is going to work?
Sure, and hopefully you've heard a version of this before. You'll hear it again. A lot of the first one, we're just kind of figuring out where to go. So first of all, you go to Moodle. This is an online exam, not a paper exam. Now, the time you do this will vary. So for most of you, it's whatever your lecture time is, 9 o'clock or 11:10. Others of you have got a survey where we gave you some other choices and you've scheduled a time separately. But whatever that time is, you'll have 70 minutes to go on Moodle, and you'll open up a quiz that we'll have linked there. So this should look like a longer version of the quizzes you've been taking. It's the same kind of format. In the first 3 quizzes that we've done in September, we've tried to actually preview types of questions. So hopefully some of it's already pretty familiar. You have 70 minutes, it's open notes, open book, but that 70 minutes will just count down. If you run into technical problems, first of all, understand Moodle will save your work. You don't have to worry about that. Just try restarting, maybe try a different browser. If worse comes to worse, restart your computer. I mean, those are kind of the classic troubleshooting solutions. And basically, we've done this in different formats before, and it works pretty well, so we're not expecting trouble. Sam, how should students prepare for connection questions? Some of this test should be pretty straightforward, kind of multiple choice matching things, but they are going to have these 4 connection questions that require a little bit more work. What advice do you have?
For one thing, I would pay attention to the storyline of the course. I mean, we do timelines a lot in lecture and in small group, and that's not about dates. That's about narrative. So a lot of the connections come through narrative. You know, they're sort of causal. One thing leads to another. One thing, if you're thinking about telling a story, you have to talk about this term in order to understand this term, or you have to look at this reading in order to understand this reading. Those are places where connections exist. Another way to think about how to study for this is create a web. Start with a term. I like to use Alexander the Great as a good pivot term for this course. And just think, so start with Alexander the Great and take a sheet of paper, and in the middle of the page, write Alexander the Great, and then draw little lines off of him connecting any other term we talked about in this course that connects directly to him. And then go the next step out and say, okay, those terms that connect to him, what other terms connect to those terms? And within a few moves, you will realize that everything we've covered in this course is connected, right? So you can start to see connection questions. Then maybe go through and highlight the mastery terms and say, okay, here's another way to think about connection questions. Third way to go about it, and in some ways this is maybe the most helpful, is to look for the connections we've drawn in class. And where have we drawn connections in class? Look for things where we talk about how something is a response to something else, or something is struggling with something else, or where we're seeing a disagreement. So we talked about the Gnostics in Tertullian as having this disagreement about how you interact with Greek philosophy. That's a good place to find potential connection questions. And then finally, look for parallels. You know, look for, I think when it's hard to talk about, you know, Perpetua and not think about Antigone, you know, because like you have these two people who are holding to religious principles in the face of state responsibilities and family responsibilities and things like that. So, you know, there's a parallel there. Well, that's a potential connection question as well. So I would say those are the types of things I would be doing if I was preparing for connection questions. Chris, any last words of advice for students as they're getting ready for this exam?
Well, I think we're kind of saying the same things over and over, but it's worth saying again, like time management is probably the biggest challenge facing you. I mean, whether you're doing it on Moodle or if this were face-to-face, like that's 70 minutes seems like a lot, but we're actually covering a lot of ground here. There are a lot of different types of questions, challenging you to use different skills or different knowledge. Now, one thing that makes it a little bit easier is you've got a take-home essay, this application essay that you can do on the weekend, you can do before, or you just turn that in separately. So what I would say is what Sam told me, which I think is really good advice. Allocate like 10 minutes for each connection question, and that leaves you half an hour for all of these objective multiple choice matching questions. You can do this in any order you want. If you want to start with the connection questions, that's fine. It might help you in some ways to start with the objective stuff. It might kind of jog your memory as to what that big narrative is. You might even kind of anticipate some of the connections. Sometimes it's easiest just start with whatever you feel like is your strongest thing, whether it's vocab matching or a map or a timeline, or you just really feel like you've got the connections down. Start and give yourself some momentum. The challenge is like if you're struggling on a connection question, like you don't want to linger there for like 20 minutes and then feel rushed on the others. So you kind of have to be disciplined about managing your time there. And with the rest of it, like as we've said a few times, you just can't walk into this test thinking that without preparing, you're going to suddenly just go find 10 quotations, or you're going to look up all this vocab and find it. And you can do that, but it's going to take you a long time and you're going to feel rushed with everything else. So mostly it's how you use the time leading up to the test that actually is the most important thing to manage. And we're giving you a lot of resources for that, including this webisode, extra TA hours, but a lot of it is just up to you. How are you going to use your time to study well in the days leading up to the test? Okay, well, that's our introduction to what's coming up. In segment 2, we're actually going to talk about 9 or 10 mastery terms probably and see which of them are actually the most significant. I'll give it away. They're all significant, but it's fun to play ranking games. So we'll do that with Professor Shady in just a sec. Welcome to segment 2 of this pre-exam 1 episode of our webisode series. Sam's going to step out at this point, and we're joined by CMOD's own Professor Sarah Shady, Chair of the Philosophy Department of Bethel. Sarah, thanks for joining us.
I am happy to be here.
Now, we should say Sarah is a veteran of podcasting and webisoding for CWC, so I think you can just kind of step right in. We don't have to warm you up or anything.
I'm ready to go. I'm
Okay.
ready to take some people down.
And it's going to be me, unfortunately. I am the sacrificial lamb for what we like to call food chain. So we always like to play a game of some sort that helps us review some readings or mastery terms. And since we're about to come to the Unit 1 test, we thought we should do kind of an all Unit 1 review called food chain. So what's going to happen is Sarah and I have each picked what we are going to argue are the 5 most significant figures from Unit 1, not counting Jesus. That's our kind of codicil to the rules of food chain, because once upon a time, Sarah pulled out and played the Jesus card at one point and won.
And I didn't win. That's the shock.
Oh, you didn't win? Well,
a class of CWC students voted that Jesus was not the most significant figure.
we should really talk about that, but let's move on. So Sarah is going to go first. We're going to start number 5, work our way up to number 1. We do not know our lists as far as I don't know your list, Sarah, and I don't think you know my list.
I do not.
Entirely independently. So we'll see if we overlap at all. What's your number 5, Sarah?
My number 5 is Aristotle. Now, you might be thinking, of course, she's a philosopher, and that's part of it, but Aristotle is foundational to an entire trajectory of philosophy and theology in the West. We're going to be reading Aquinas in Unit 2 of Airways. They're deeply influenced by Aristotle. Aristotle sets up one of the 2 major threads that philosophy that we gather knowledge by studying the concrete world around us. So Aristotle, kudos to you.
I'm not surprised, but I'm curious to see if that's the only philosopher on your list. I have a feeling it's not. I'll come to one later. I'm going to start with a different Athenian from about that time period, so 5th century, and talk about Sophocles. And I'm going to make the case that partly it's very easy to overlook the poets and the writers of this class. Like I know I do this when I talk about ancient religion. I hardly spend any time on Homer. I should probably spend like half an hour on Homer. And so to make up for that, I'm going to say that Sophocles is very important because it's in this kind of poetry that the Greeks, in some ways, are really working through the big questions of life. They do it in philosophy. They do it in the Academy and the Lyceum, but they're also doing it in theater. And so I wish I'd spent more time in small group on Antigone, and I wish we in some ways read more of Sophocles than just Antigone. But to me, that's really distinctive of how the Greeks and maybe some of their heirs are going to work through questions about what is justice, what is the role of the individual, what is the role of women, maybe even is kind of being worked through by Sophocles there. So as a stand-in for some of the other figures that we have in our reading packet, and also, honestly, a lot of the people we don't include in our reading packet, I'm going to say we need to at least nod towards the poets and include Sophocles here. Sarah, who's number 4 on your list?
Number 4 is Plato. So I'm going to stick with the philosophers for a minute. And I did, even though my personal preference is for Aristotle, I put Plato ahead of Aristotle because Aristotle would have had no one to respond to were it not for Plato coming first. Plato is foundational. We talk about Socrates as the father of Western philosophy, but what we know about him comes through the writings of Plato. So really, a 20th century philosopher said that all of philosophy is a footnote to Plato, and I think that's really true.
Okay, well, I'm amazed you can not just do like 4 tie or something. You've actually got them ranked 4 and 5. That's impressive. I'm going to say St. Anthony is number 4. And here again, like I want to include something that's easy to overlook, which is monasticism. And in some ways, this will become more clear as we get to the Middle Ages, where some later monastics like Benedict and Hildegard and Francis, and even Thomas Aquinas, who's a Dominican monk, will become so central to medieval Christianity. But you had to start in the 3rd and 4th century with St. Anthony. And I think in a class about Christianity and Western culture, it's really important to get this kind of minority opinion about how Christians are supposed to relate to the culture, which is to maintain some kind of distance from it. Whether you're doing that by literally retreating to the wilderness and sealing yourself up in a tomb like Anthony does, or he returns and he moves to Alexandria in the midst of the persecution, but he uses spiritual disciplines, or his followers will use communities called monasteries to maintain a different kind of separation from the culture. That's not how I live my life. That's not my way of relating to culture, but it is an important way that Christians pretty early on decide they should withdraw even from a Christian Constantinian culture. So I'll put Anthony number 4 for that reason. Okay, number 3, Sarah, we're getting close to the top.
I know, that's good. And I'm glad that you're working with the margins. Sometimes the most important questions are coming from those. But my third one is another mainstream big voice, and that is Augustine, Bishop of Hippos. So I picked him also in terms of influence because so many doctrinal issues for both Catholics and Protestants moving forward are going to be rooted in Augustine's writings. So much happens at the end of the 300s, beginning of 400s, as the state is really becoming formally associated with the Roman Empire, and the sorts of questions that Christians have to think about, whether that's what is orthodox belief about the structure of the church, to, whether or not Christians should go to war, what should a Christian government look like, what's the role of a Christian in the government. Augustine writes about everything. And so in terms of Christian theology, if we're not still holding on to Augustine's beliefs about something, we've had to argue against it. So Augustine really shapes Western Christianity.
Well, here I have to admit that I left him off, even though Sam in segment 1 tried to convince me that he's very important. And I'm just going to do this because I know we come back to Augustine. I talk about him in the lecture right after the test. So I'm going to, if I get to play this game again, I'll put him in my second list. I'm going to go back to what you called the father of Western philosophy and talk about Socrates at number 3. I knew I stood no chance at making a better case for Plato or Aristotle, so I thought I won't even put them on. I will instead put Socrates as a stand-in for the entirety of the Greek philosophical tradition, because even if we need Plato to write it down, you needed Socrates to teach Plato to give him material to write him down. And Socrates really is the fountainhead for the kind of inquiry and thinking that we're calling philosophy in this course. I mean, I know there are pre-Socratic philosophers too, but I find it pretty powerful. This notion that in humility, we can seek after truth. And I mean, that's animating so much of what we all do in a class like CWC, or even, I'm not a philosopher, but as a historian, there's something Socratic about what I'm trying to do. And I really am taken with this notion that he is meant to be this gadfly affixed to the state, to the society. Christians will talk later about the job of the prophet is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And I think really it's something we've inherited from Socrates almost as much as from Jewish prophets. And so even though in some ways he's not as important a writer in the tradition, certainly he, I think, is important as the source of the tradition. So I'll put Socrates number 3. All right, getting to really hard choices now. Number 2, Sarah.
I stuck with the theme of empire. And so my number 2 is Constantine, because at the moment when Constantine legalizes Christianity, puts the power of the Roman Empire and the wealth of the Roman Empire behind the Christian church, I think Christianity in the West fundamentally changes. Prior to that, Christians are thinking about, how do I honor Jesus? And, how do my allegiance is to Christ, not to the Roman Empire. Thinking, why didn't Jesus overturn the Roman Empire? And now we have the Roman Empire officially Christian by the time we get into the late 300s. Not that Constantine didn't make it the official religion of the empire, but he started the path to that. Constantine's mother toured the Middle East, establishing churches at holy sites. Constantine calls the Council of Nicaea. He's, putting his political power behind the need for Christians to get orthodoxy figured out and doctrines moving forward. So I don't think we can ignore the role that Constantine plays in shaping Christianity.
No, absolutely. And I know we're going to hear more from you about this in our last lecture before the test. So this is kind of a nice little preview of some things we'll talk about later. I'm going to go in a different direction and talk about Perpetua for number 2. And in some ways, because she's such an important contrast to the Christianity that comes after the Edict of Milan. She is the example we give of martyrdom as a kind of witness and a kind of faithful Christian discipleship. And her story is such a nice encapsulation of the tensions that are going to exist between Christianity and the kinds of hierarchy in the Greco-Roman world. The obedience to the state, obedience of women to men, of children to fathers. Instead, what does it mean to truly call Christ Lord? And so her story is really powerful in that way. But I also want to include her because in some ways she really stands in for what I take to be the majority within early Christianity, which is women. and the poor, and people who are on the margins of society. It's one of the reasons that a lot of Romans look down on Christianity, is they view it as this religion where if you want to learn about it, go talk to the women, go talk to the slaves, go talk to the manual laborers and the unwanted. And so she actually comes from an aristocratic background as far as we know, but she intentionally puts herself on the margins of her society. And just as a woman, she already is on the margins of those society. And so that's, I think, something as we get into a Constantinian Christian world where it becomes very easy to access power through faith. It's important to remember that's not really where the story of the church begins. And so Perpetua stands in for me in that sense too. All right, well, it's not Augustine, it's not Constantine, it's not Plato or Aristotle. Sarah, who can your number one choice be?
Well, I am really fascinated by the different themes that we each chose for our lists, because our lists, there's such a strong contrast. And I really went with the big names and the empire builders. So my number one is Alexander the Great. I was talking about Alexander the Great in small group last week. And I said, without Alexander the Great, you don't have a unified language, a unified culture into which Christianity can be born. You don't have, even though Rome controls the politics and law and order, at that point in time, the world is fundamentally Greek in the way that it thinks. And that's going to continue for hundreds of years after, the birth of Christ as well. So I think Alexander the Great, I don't think he necessarily knew that he was going to have this impact. I think mostly he probably just thought it was cool to take stuff over. But the spread of Greek culture through his empire is an undeniable, lasting significance to the world that we inhabit today.
Well, Sarah clearly has won this because I'm just overthinking everything and putting in relatively obscure figures. But my theme has been I pick someone to stand in for other people. And so to stand in for someone like Alexander, Augustus Caesar, I did go with Constantine as my number one for all the reasons Sarah said, which are hugely important. In some ways, he's also the last example of someone who can unify the Roman Empire. It's the last gasp of this worldly example of incredible power and success and status. And it's something that later Europeans in the Middle Ages will aspire to. The restoration of Constantine's empire is what someone like Charlemagne is trying to do around the year 800 or so. But more because of everything that Sarah's already said that we're going to talk more about on Friday in the Complicating lecture. This is such an important turning point in the history of Christianity. And it saves lives. We shouldn't minimize that. But there's a reason that, and Sarah, in your tradition, growing up Anabaptist, there are Anabaptist theologians who say this is the second fall. That the first is Adam and Eve in the garden. And the second is, we're given another chance, right, to make something that was truly righteous and primitive and faithful. And instead, we bit a different kind of apple with Constantine and sacrificed faithfulness to a different kind of worldly status and power and gave into a temptation. So I don't know that I agree with that personally, but that's a really powerful critique within the history of Christianity. And it should be something students are looking for as we move on, that we're going to see that allure of politics and military power and economic success, and that traces its way back to Constantine. So, well played, Sarah. I've already conceded defeat in the vote that we're not actually going to have. So I don't know why I did that.
Too early. Conceding too early. There's a lot of power at the margins. So
true.
Yeah, very good.
Well, most importantly, hopefully that's useful for students because it gives us a chance to talk through maybe 8 to 10 more people that you've heard about, but maybe it's good to just hear them again before you take the test. So hopefully that was helpful. Sarah, thanks for joining us. Sam and I will be back in just a moment to say goodbye for this webisode. Sam, as usual, we're running out of time. Thanks to Sarah Shady for joining us, but let's get to segment 3. It's happy time. You ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, happy birthday to Alfonso Ribeiro. Carlton Banks of the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air is 49 years old today. Sam, you're a resident sitcom aficionado. What's an 80s or 90s sitcom that you would love to see rebooted?
I'm going to answer your question, but I want to show how much of a sitcom aficionado I am, which is the real Alfonso Ribeiro role is he was on 72 episodes of Silver Spoons from 1984 to 1987
You're
as
just
playing
showing off.
Alfonso Spears. So like that's the real role.
Yeah.
You know, I would say the obvious one is you could redo something like Cheers really well. I think that actually is pretty timeless. You know, have a something like a bar be a place that substitutes as a family. I would say if we wanted something that was a little of the moment, you could do something like News Radio, which is a really good 90s sitcom, but do it in like the podcast world. I think would be pretty great.
And Joe Rogan could just play himself, basically.
There you go. Chris, happy anniversary. The Hobbit, J.R.R. Tolkien's original Middle-earth story, was first published on this day in 1937. Chris, on a scale of 1 to 10, how big of a Lord of the Rings fan are you?
Well, if 10 is Dwight Schrute going to New Zealand to walk the Mordor Trail, and 1 is my wife, I'm probably like a 5. I'll split the difference. I love the original Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings trilogy. I showed the extended DVDs to my kids this year. I did not love the Hobbit films, and I do not love the original books themselves. So on the basis of those 3 movies, I think I'll give myself a 5, maybe a 4.5 if I'm being uncharitable. So Sam, happy trails to the Galileo spacecraft, which spent 8 years studying Jupiter before being crashed on that planet on this day in 2003. You knew that I wrote the script because there's like a space thing in it.
That's right.
Sam, we're going to meet the actual Galileo in Unit 3. Why should students be excited for that part of the class?
I think because we really start to dig into the sort of faith reason debate, and especially faith and science questions, which in the world we live in today, as we're thinking about climate change and all these kinds of things, are such important conversations to have. So I think that there's so much there that speaks directly to the world that we're living in, and we see lots of different useful answers to the question of how faith and science relate to each other.
It's coming up in November. I didn't think November would ever actually seem that close, but it's getting close. So students, you've got one more small group and one more complicating lecture, we're calling it, before Monday's exam. At that lecture on Friday, you're going to get your application essay, which you then have the weekend to work on, and you can turn in anytime before your exam time on Monday the 28th. Sam, do you want to make a pitch for expanded? What were the TAs doing before the exam?
On Thursday night, the TAs have some special directed office hours, so between 6 and 9 p.m. So they're going to be doing, I think the first hour is a practice quote quiz. At 6, at 7, they're doing a timeline, and at 8, they're doing mastery terms. So go in and you can work with the TAs. They'll be doing those almost like mini workshops. So I think those can be really helpful.
Okay, well, that's it for this webisode. Sam, thanks for joining me.
Anytime.
I don't know why I'm doing that. I'm not really the host here. Hopefully this is helpful, students, as we get closer to the test. And we will see you on the other side of the test. Until then, say goodnight, Stacy.